Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. This is your host, Eric. Today I'm joined by someone that I know personally, professionally, and a man I look up to in strong regard. Before I go on rambling, welcome, DC Deputy Chief Andy McCurdy.
Morning, Eric. How are you today?
I'm great. Yourself?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a bit overdue. And I want to provide a little bit of context and intro how I came to learn about you and how I came to meet you. Um, I met your brother first, so that's probably a letdown for an older brother to be like, "Dude, why does it have to be that way?" No, but
I am the younger brother.
Oh, you're the younger brother. That's right.
Yeah.
I know I'm all twisted.
I'm also the more fuel efficient version. So
yeah, are you talking about just sheer mass to move around?
yeah, that too.
Okay. So. Now I'm curious what you're talking about because so Pat's been on the show, but I do explain how he's just a hulking man. You're a very strong fit man as well, with a strength and athletic background as well, which is very relevant for police wellness and fitness, as we'll get into.
Well, I was very fortunate growing up because I could never inherit his clothing because he was always husky size and I was always slim size. So I got to get new clothes. Yeah. So that was good.
That is a very, very special thing for a younger brother, a younger sibling.
Yeah. Plus, he was a good protector as an older brother because he's enormous.
That's good. How much of you coming into law enforcement was because, well, I know a bit about your family as we get into in that episode, but for those that haven't listened into Pat McCurdy, you need to download that one next. But how much of that, two brothers coming into law enforcement, did you influence and kind of go on that path together?
So quite a bit, actually. I think, my brother and I are very similar in kind of our bearings and why we do things. I think we have very different approaches to a lot of the same work. And growing up, it was always that way as well. But my parents were both police officers. My mom was only a cop for a few years, and then she quit to stay home and raise my brother and I. But my dad was in law enforcement for over 40 years. And so growing up, my brother always did things a year and a half, 2 years ahead of me. So like first job, cleaning parking lots for some guy at our church that hired us for $2 an hour to clean parking lots. My brother did it first, and then I came along with him and helped later. And we both started working when we were 12 or 13 years old with that. But and then with the police department, my brother became a police explorer with Hayward PD when he was like 14 and a half. And then a couple years later, when I was 14 and a half, I joined as well. Yeah. And then actually, he went to work for Newark Police Department in California as a cadet or a community service officer. I went to work for Pleasanton. And then he went to work for Hayward, which is where we grew up and where my dad had been a cop working in the jail. And then he actually got hired by King County and left the jail. And on my hiring paperwork to work in the jail, it showed who I was replacing, and I actually replaced him in that job. And then he came up here to Washington. I actually kind of talked him into it. Got hired by King County Sheriff's Department. And then a couple years later, I got hired by Port of Seattle because King County had a hiring freeze, and I was with Port of Seattle for a couple of years and then got hired by King County as well. So I kind of always followed a year and a half, 2 years behind him on a lot of that stuff. And he's always been my best friend, and we're more than just brothers. We're always been pretty tight. So
yeah, interesting. How long were you at the port?
I think 2.5 years.
Okay. And then the goal was to get to county?
No, so my whole life, every job I've been in, I've always been like, hey, this is the world's best job. And I've never really had a career goal or an aspiration of any kind other than I wanted to be a cop since I was a kid.
Look at you now.
Yeah. But yeah, so Port, I went there thinking I'd stay, and then I had an opportunity to go to King County because they started hiring laterals, which they hadn't done in a long time, and wanted to be a little busier and not kind of stuck at the airport or the waterfront. So I jumped over there.
Yeah, it was very cool. Yeah, as I explained in my episode with Pat, I met Pat after Diego died in duty, and him and his team came in, swooped in, King County's peer support to offer so many critical incident debrief sessions for my team. And I was kind of more the co-pilot, as far as like a familiar face, being a coordinator and a peer support member at Kent. But that was just so flooring in so many ways. One, the support within the community, but also providing the framework that y'all did at King County so well that you've carried on now to Sumner, in the region, truly. But yeah, I was so floored with like the response and recognized that there was something that I needed to build at my own agency and then continue to pay that forward. So it's been very humbling to be kind of part of this different subset of the law enforcement tribe, if you will, in the peer supporters. And then you're so big on that. And it's and I don't remember if we talked about this, but I actually heard your interview with Lexi and Callie, the Eura podcast, and I hadn't actually met Lexi Harris, SPD officer, who was struck and killed off duty, pulling over to help motorists on the side of the highway. For those that aren't regional, those that are regional know the story, and it's absolutely tragic. But I don't think I'd met you at the time. I'd heard your name like a billion times, and I'd actually reached out and started talking to Lexi and Callie, having not met either of them, about their podcast, like years before I did anything on this podcast. Like I was just starting my social media, and one of my people actually said, "Hey, check out this podcast. These gals are really cool, and they talk about police leadership and such." But I got to listen to your story and learn so much more about you before meeting you. And then, years later, fast forward, you are leading the charge to help support Lexi's service. And I know that there's a connection there. And then also Deputy Dom Calata in Pierce County. And so my intention is not to start heavy, but we may as well get into it because you're a roll your sleeves up kind of guy. And I know you don't shy away from hard conversations and these critical conversations, but I say that as a hybrid intro, but also like a big thank you on behalf of myself personally. And I've picked your brain on personal things, professional things, so kind of a third life or third career kind of crisis things. And so I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart, but also on behalf of certainly the region, as you've stepped up and demonstrated leadership, vulnerability, and all these things that we're going to be talking about.
Well, you deserve it. So anything I can do to help, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where does that type of desire? I mean, cops, first responders come in with so much love and service to others, but where does that flavor of desire come out specifically for peer support and wellness?
So growing up as the son of a police officer in Hayward, California, Hayward's a kind of a crappy little city outside of Oakland. And, growing up I used to joke around with my brother that, in fact, I looked it up the other day. Hayward is the second most diverse city in the state of California. And like our high school, it was about a third Hispanic, a third Asian, a third Black, and then my brother and I. And being the son of a cop too kind of added some difficulties for me there growing up. Luckily, like I said earlier, I had an enormous older brother, and I think my brother and I both get along with everyone, so it wasn't a struggle or anything. But it was interesting because my dad working for Hayward was one of the first agencies in California that really embraced community-oriented policing and as a formal program. And my dad had been doing that since the 1960s when he worked for Oakland PD. And, for growing up, what I saw a police officer as is not only a law enforcer, but also somebody who's involved with community groups and church and in other ways. Hayward was kind of unique because at the back of Hayward Police Department, they had a division called Youth and Family Services Bureau. And my dad for a while was the sergeant in charge of that. And they had social workers, marriage and family therapists, school resource officers, special assault detectives, a prosecutor, all working together in the back of the PD. And when a family was in crisis, whether it was because their kid was a victim of a crime, a witness to a crime, or suspected of committing a crime, they could come to the police department of all places to get kind of wraparound care and services and support. My family, my brother he won't always admit to this, my brother was a very difficult teenager, and we actually sought counseling there as a family. And my brother actually refused to participate in that as a teenager, but I got a lot out of it. And so I always thought that's what a police department was. I went to work for a couple of years for Pleasanton Police Department as a community service officer. And then when Hayward had an opening, I switched from that to full-time at Hayward PD. And that department always felt like a family to me, not just the PD, but that whole community felt like a family. And then I got hired and moved up here to Washington, and I found out how unique that really was. I have yet to find a place that felt as much like a family as that department. And I think that fact that Youth and Family Services Bureau existed in the PD and that officers were willing to actually use that service for their own families kind of set a foundation for me about being very open about my struggles and and also my successes and kind of celebrating those, but to be open and aware of what's available and being willing to go out and seek it early instead of waiting until things get bad, right? So, fast forward as a cop, I was always a pretty hard charger on patrol. I liked working busy areas, working for King County Sheriff's Department. I always tried to pick the busiest shift in the busiest district, and pretty quickly got promoted to corporal and was field training officer and everything. And I had fun on that side. And then I had a child with my first wife. When my daughter was about a year old, we got a divorce, and it was a very amicable split. We were both very career oriented. I never thought I wanted a kid. And then I had a kid and found out that's what I was built for. And when we got divorced, it was going along pretty good until it was about a year after getting a divorce. My daughter was probably 2 years old at the time. And I got served with papers that my ex-wife was going to move to Maryland and take my daughter with her. And at the time I had just transferred to the special assault unit as an investigator. And so I was working a day shift, Monday through Thursday gig. And we had it set up pretty good where I had my daughter for half of my days off, 3 days a week. And then my ex-wife was working patrol on a 410. So she had our daughter on her days off, and then we split our common work day for childcare, and it was going along pretty good. But when I got served with papers, I started spinning out. I was really struggling, and reached out to my sergeant at the time in special assault unit and told him what I was going through. And I hadn't even told my family what all I was going through. And I got a lot of love and support from my coworkers, working for the sheriff's department in special assault. At the time there was like 14 detectives and 2 sergeants in that unit. And they just really provided a lot of care and love and support. My partner, Mary, was one of the best cops I ever worked with, but she's also one of the most kind and caring human beings I've ever known. So, going through that was hard. I reached the first thing, even before when I got my divorce, the first thing I did is I reached out for help and started seeing a counselor. And throughout my life, I've always kind of seen a counselor for one thing or another. And I've always benefited a lot from that. It's funny, like with counseling, we always think especially with marriage counseling, we always think we're going to go there to fix the other person. And we quickly find out that really it's about fixing ourselves. And
that's
so,
deep.
So I think that going through that to try to save my marriage, and it ultimately ended up in a divorce, but it was for the best. So luckily, even though I was going through crisis at the time, I think because I had a lot of resources, people I could reach out to, it made things go a lot smoother. Ultimately, my daughter ended up staying here, and I'm still my daughter's 22 now, and we're, still best friends and really close and everything. But, for me, all of that kind of set that stage for being open about my struggles, and whether it be with my family, my coworkers, my employer. I think when you first notice that you're going through a crisis, when you reach out for help and you have appropriate resources that are going to come out there and help you, I think it makes all the difference. I look at a lot of other partners and friends who've gone through really similar situations and ended up resorting to, alcohol or other substances or risky behaviors or whatever else they're doing to distract from their trauma. And I think I've been fortunate that I never have, because I've been able to reach out early. Fast forward to that, I ended up getting remarried. My second wife was a social worker. So I went from being married to a cop, who thought that would go bad, to being married to a social worker. And, she's also my biggest support system. And I think I'm fortunate to have a wife that I can speak very openly to about these things. But we still have our struggles as well. So anyway, when I was in the special assault unit, my wife at the time was working for the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center, and I was investigating sexual assault, child death, things like that. So having a person who understood that was a big help. But eventually my wife, we really struggled to get pregnant, had to do in vitro, and ended up making the decision to implant 2 fertilized embryos, knowing that it was more likely that at least one of them would survive. And lo and behold, she ended up being pregnant with twins. And At the time I was working, I had left special assault unit, got promoted to sergeant, worked patrol for a little while. And then I got drafted downtown to work in internal investigations. And, at the time my wife's pregnant with twins. It's a high risk pregnancy because of her age. She was like in her 30s, and that's considered geriatric pregnancy, apparently.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I was working the most stressful job I've ever had and going through a stressful pregnancy. And I remember I was with one of my partners from the homicide unit, and we actually had gone up to Orcas Island or something like that, taking a ferry over there to arrest a homicide suspect that also had information on an internal I was doing. And I got a call from my wife while we were there saying that she was at doing a checkup at Overlake Hospital, and that they were going to hospitalize her because she was sick. And even though she didn't realize it, her blood pressure was extremely high. She had preeclampsia. And so I'm like literally just arresting a guy, and we're getting ready to get on a ferry to drive back. I'm going to have to drive all the way back to Seattle, drop this guy off at the jail, take my partner back to Kent to the Regional Justice Center, drop him off so I can go home and get our stuff. And, she's getting transported to Swedish hospital to be hospitalized. And, of course I'm spinning out. Luckily the partner I was with is a good friend, a really good guy who's supportive of it. So we basically just hauled ass back and dropped this guy at the jail, and we kind of interviewed him on the ride and everything. But eventually my wife ended up delivering our twins 16 weeks premature. Wow. So Nora and Colton was born, he was 1 pound 3 ounces, and Nora was about 1 pound 9 ounces. So literally like the size of a Barbie doll. And, they were up at Swedish hospital. Eventually my son was up there for about 7 or 8 months. My daughter was up there for about 4 months. And while they were up there, I was actually working downtown Seattle at the courthouse. And every morning my wife and I would drive into work together, and I'd drop her off at Swedish hospital. I'd walk down to work at the courthouse, work my day. And then at the end of the day, I'd walk back up, and we'd spend the evenings at the hospital. And our daughter was staying with her mom or my mom to kind of take care of her, because we were there for the long haul. My son was really, really sick from birth, and went through, he had about 24 blood transfusions, had about over a dozen different surgeries. We had a friend of ours who was a priest who actually administered last rites a couple of times because we didn't think he was going to make it. And I was trying to preserve my leave because I knew that when the twins went home, for one, we knew our daughter would probably go home earlier, and then we would be stuck, one person having to be at the hospital, one having to be at home taking care of our other child. So I was trying to preserve my leave, so I kept working while they were up at Swedish. And, my personality has always been, during times of stress, I'm the emergency response guy, right? I put my head down, I get shit done. It is what it is, right? You got to work through it. And then I would kind of push things off, and then I'd have healthy ways to have a release and kind of work through stuff and reach out to support and care. But especially dealing with a child that ended up with multiple disabilities and still to this day has a lot of medical issues, that stress doesn't go away. You can't just put your head down and push on, right? You got to really figure out how to balance life and work and, stress and trauma and all that. So, going through that, I think I had to tap into every resource I've ever known. Luckily for me, I'd been involved in peer support already for a long time with King County and was a team leader there, and had a lot of connections with mental health professionals, chaplains, partners that I trusted, peers that I could reach out to. And, a lot of people stepped up, and it was interesting. Like even while we were in the hospital, people are always asking, "Hey, what can I do? What can I do?" And you don't even know what you need, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when people actually just show up and do something, it just means a lot, right? I had one of our deputies who I didn't even know that well. He showed up and delivered like frozen meals for us, and he like a month's worth of food that him and his wife had made for us. And to know that we could, have a home cooked meal just by heating up in the microwave was huge. And there were different ways that different people showed up for us while we were going through that. Part of my story though is, because of my nature, I'm always kind of the calm one, right? And if you think about, if we all kind of have a zone where we're resilient, and we experience highs and lows in life, and as long as we stay within that zone, we're still able to kind of function normally, right? And I've always felt like I was very emotionally stable, and no matter what I went through at work or at home, I always felt like my bumps were smaller than most people's bumps. And I thought that was because I had a really healthy way of dealing with stress. And I used to joke around and tell people that I was dead inside because I wouldn't have big reactions to big problems. I would have small reactions and kind of move on. And I think normally that it was because I had a healthy way of dealing with things. And for a long time, that being dead inside as a joke was just meant that I was right down the middle of that resiliency zone, right? Um, but then, fast forward a number of years and, still dealing with my son's medical issues and his twin sister having her own struggles and, dealing with, my other older child and an ex-wife and family stress and work stress and so on and so forth. Things pile up, and all of those resources I typically had that were helpful for me, like exercise as an example. I've been a sports performance coach for as long as I've been a cop. I've been a cop now for in law enforcement for 30 something years. And in college, I actually originally was a sports science major, and I worked in a physical therapy clinic and did that stuff and continued on coaching and everything. And so for a period of time there, when my kids had first gotten out of the hospital, I was training at a CrossFit gym here in Sumner. And initially I started helping out so I didn't have to pay $200 a month to be a member, right?
Yeah.
And then as time went on, more and more they would ask me to coach. And at one point I was coaching, I would get up at 3:00 in the morning to go work out. And then I would coach a 4 a.m. and a 5 a.m. class. And then I would jump in my car and drive up to King County to work and, come back home and rinse and repeat, have to go to bed early because I was getting up early. And, I did that for like 7 years. And, that to me, exercise was something that always kept me healthy emotionally and otherwise.
Yeah.
But I was just driving myself into the ground. And, at the time I was a leader of officer involved shooting investigations for the sheriff's department. We had what's called the ART team, administrative review team. So we would do a parallel response with the criminal investigations team. We would respond to the administrative investigation. I was on that team for about 12 years. I was also peer support team lead. At some point I got promoted to chief and spent about 6 years as a chief of police in a contract city for the sheriff's department. And for me, it was just do more, right? Work harder. And at some point, I started falling apart physically, emotionally, relationship wise. I felt like I was still doing pretty good, but I started having these weird physical problems. Like I had a rupture of my soleus tendon, which is the tendon that runs up behind your calf muscle. And I got that when I was at a coaching clinic doing sprint drills. And it was, first of all, I was pushing it too hard, trying to, keep up with all these young guys. But that was a big setback. I had to do a few months worth of therapy to recover from that ruptured tendon. As I'm recovering from that, I blew out both SI joints on my lower back. And that's really painful and just uncomfortable. I did therapy for that. I start to recover, and then I tear my rotator cuff. And I was actually working an off-duty job directing traffic, and I tossed a cone. And when I tossed the cone, I tore my rotator cuff, right?
Man.
Which, working in physical therapy, I know that it wasn't tossing that traffic cone that hurt my shoulder. It was all this other stuff going on in my life, right? It was
that was the straw, right?
Yeah. So as I'm recovering from that, doing therapy, then I have a complete pec rupture. And I ruptured my pec in my garage, warming up to do bench. And I had 20-pound dumbbells, and I was doing pec flies. And I could press a lot more than that, right?
Yeah.
But, here I was, the wellness guy, peer support guy, the physical fitness guy, ended up having these injuries that were completely preventable. And, I know now looking back, a lot of what was going on with me is this expectation I had for myself of being right down the middle of my resiliency zone and staying calm under pressure was actually meant that my nervous system was so dysregulated. I wasn't actually down the middle of that resiliency zone. I was actually bumped out low, way outside that resiliency zone. And what I was really experiencing is I was not only having these physical issues, but I also wasn't experiencing joy, right? And, this, the pride and everything else that gets in the way of really stepping back from yourself and unplugging and taking some things off your plate is what gets in the way of us really healing and being better. Because again, a lot of us are like me, where we just do more to get better, right? And that's not always the best remedy. So when something like that happens, I had to have pretty major shoulder surgery to repair a bunch of the damage there. And, being stuck for about 8 weeks, not being able to move my arm at all in a sling, is pretty humbling for somebody like myself. And, it's also something where you have to step up in front of the people you work for and the people who you lead on a peer support team and talk about, what your struggles are, because that's the root of what happened to me, right? So for me, a lot of it became having to really step back and slow down and focus on what's really important, start saying no a little bit. In the meantime, I'm still getting asked to do a lot of things while I'm also recovering myself. And, fortunately through all this, I continue to see a therapist, physical, emotional, mental therapy, whatever it takes, I'm in. But again, even with that, doing less sometimes is the answer. And, even as a leader, being able to prioritize and delegate, do things to really step back. The problem we have is none of our systems are really set up to prevent these things from happening in the first place. But then when a lot of people go off the rails like I did, we're kind of are left flapping in the wind to a certain extent. And, our everybody talks about how jacked up our criminal justice system is, but our mental health system, our hospital health system, our, you name a system in our country right now, it's messed up. And I feel like first responders, with our personalities and the way we do things, we pay a bigger price than a lot. So for me, it was about doing less and stepping back. And I've been since then trying to focus more on being a true leader. And, for me, at one point, a leader meant that I would do everything that nobody else wanted to do. But now I realize that being a leader is about, preparing systems, preparing policy, preparing budget so that we have the funding, we have the resources, we have the people to do the work that needs to be done. And not just sitting back and complaining about how, we're misunderstood, or the legislature doesn't understand us, or the public doesn't understand us, but actually figuring out how we can make meaningful change to improve the lives of the people who work for us, right? When our officers are the ones out there interacting with the public, and we do a lot of training and things to teach officers how to do a better job out there and interacting with the public. And a lot of those same lessons for them that I've, classes I've taught over the years, like procedural justice or crisis intervention, that's also the same skill sets that I need to have as a leader. And as much as it's important for our officers to interact a different way with the public, it's also important that I, as a leader, interact differently with my people, because I don't want people to experience what I experienced, right? Yeah. I want to be able to recognize that early and know what the interventions are, and be able to make sure that somebody sees, because I've done it as well, that it's okay to reach out for help and to slow down and unplug, and, recognizing not just when, but where and how to seek help. And so for me, a lot of it's been about making better relationships with treatment providers, not just, therapists that people can see, but inpatient treatment providers for, whether it be for trauma or substance abuse or whatever else. It's about building these networks of support. I've done a lot of work with Nick Bauer from Code 4 Northwest about how do we educate treatment providers as well as our officers, so that kind of somewhere in the middle of those two can meet and really be there for each other in those times of need. Throughout my career, I've had a lot of friends and coworkers who've committed suicide. I had a lot of friends and coworkers who died in line of duty. And on both ends of that, there's things, we need to be able to look at those and ask ourselves, what could we have done better, right? And even like line of duty deaths, there's a lot of these situations where, the officer did everything right, but there's still things we could have done, right? Slowing down and having a plan and waiting for backup, all that kind of stuff is huge, because inevitably the person who's always going to pay the price is the one out there in the middle of the night by themselves, having to respond to these calls, right? It's not me sitting in the comfort of my office as a chief, but I do have a role in that of making sure that people are prepared. So is that the longest answer ever to a short question?
It is the perfect answer, because you hit on so many things that I know are of value, and I know from conversing with you that they're topics that we wanted to hit. And so what a fantastic crash course. But I do have some notes just to keep myself on track. I mean, you covered so many things, and I mean, one of the things is just that notion of redlining, and it might resonate even harder with a lot of people that tune in, because while people that do follow along with my social media or the podcast, they're just a little bit more open to things like police wellness, rather than just, saying no, just do the job and keep your mouth shut, right? But a lot of these types also, are so driven, right, to be helpful, to be a peer supporter, whether officially or unofficially, to be their best, right, physically, for their family, for their career. These doers, right? So these high expectations that you mentioned of yourself, I mean, that resonates with me. Outside of those categorical setbacks, like actual physical injuries, like what are some things that stick out to you as things that people may recognize in themselves, of like, hey, these are the signs before the big signs where I'm forced to slow down?
I think a big one I see with cops is in our society, we do a terrible job of teaching people how to pay attention to their nervous system. One of the things I teach is called community resiliency model. I went through a pretty lengthy process to become a formal instructor for it through the Trauma Resource Institute down in California. And what I think is beautiful about it, I've tried meditation. I'm terrible at it. I don't, it takes a long time to see a benefit from it. But what I like about this model that they teach is it really talks about how do we start tracking our nervous system? Because the reality is when we have these emotions, and sometimes especially if these emotions are disruptive to our healthy living, if we pay attention to our nervous system, we can recognize when our nervous system is dysregulated before that emotion is created. Because it's that dysregulation of our nervous system that creates the emotion, right? And sometimes we feel like the emotion is creating the nervous system, but it's not, right? The way our body is wired is we recognize when something is a threat, quote unquote, right? And that threat, may not in hindsight actually be a threat, right? It's not a threat to our life, oftentimes at least, but our body doesn't know the difference. And when we, for whatever reason, identify something as a threat, our nervous system starts preparing us for fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so that whole process where it upregulates our heart rate, our blood pressure, our cascade of stress hormones, downregulates our salivation and digestion, right? That whole process, when we shift into that sympathetic side of our nervous system, we can actually learn how to pay attention to that. When we notice that starting to happen, there are things we can do to shortchange it so that it doesn't turn into a negative emotion or some other negative response that's not going to be optimal for what we're trying to do. And so by learning to really start to pay attention to what goes on inside our body, and we start to notice that our heart rate is increasing, start to notice our blood pressure is going up, we start perspiring or feeling agitated or fidgety or whatever it may be in us as an individual human being. When we start to notice that, and then we have these skills that we can develop about how we can calm ourselves, we actually are going to perform better, right? So whether it's during a use of force situation when we start to become dysregulated, when I see these videos of cops doing things that are terrible, that have a negative outcome, a lot of times you especially if you see a video of the officer using force, they're showing all these signs that their nervous system is dysregulated, and you're not able to ascertain whether or not something's actually a threat. You're not able to really differentiate between somebody who's being an asshole and somebody who's dangerous, right? And so whether it's that or if it's at home when we get home from work and we're frustrated and had a bad day and our kids or our spouse say something that upsets us and we have a big reaction to it, we can do a lot to start to calm that nervous system. And I think that we don't really have the language in our society to talk about this in a meaningful way. And even in the wellness world, I see a lot of these people who are kind of known as the wellness people, like the chiefs that go around and talk about it that are wellness chiefs, or these officers that do it. A lot of these people, when you get to know them, their nervous system is super jacked up and dysregulated, right? Yeah. And a lot of it's because, especially if we are in a leadership role or we are an expert in something, we constantly have to show people that we embody it, right? But everybody sees right through that. So I love that community resiliency model. There's actually an app called iChill app that you can download for free, and it gives a lot of instruction in these different components, but they boil it down into a simple set of skills. And reset now or help now strategies is one that I really like, where you can do really simple things during those times of stress. And obviously a use of force encounter would be different than if you get home and somebody says something upsetting to you. But some things as simple as, putting your hands on the desk in front of you and paying attention to what that feels like, right? And I'm doing it right now. And as I'm doing that, I start to notice things about my desk that I've never noticed before. I set my left hand down, it's next to my computer, and there's a ton of hot air blowing out of my computer onto my hand. So my left hand is burning hot, my right hand is cold because my AC is going in my office, right? The mere fact that I shifted my attention to my hands and tracked what my hands felt like got me out of my nervous system. And I'm no longer nervous about speaking to the man that is Eric Tung. But now I'm present in the moment, and I'm able to pay attention to things, right? So I think from not just from the day we hire people and put them in the academy, but I think from the moment, I think as youth coming up, especially as men in our society, we need to start teaching people how to have this language and vocabulary and understanding of how our nervous system works, because so much of the negative things that we do or find ourselves in the middle of are because of dysregulated nervous systems of our own or somebody else's, right?
Yeah.
And I think this model is beautiful. The reason I went through the training, the state actually paid for me to go to it, and they hired me to come in this training called VCERT, which is Victim-Centered Engagement Resiliency Tactics. And it's basically mandatory training for all investigators who are assigned to a role where they're going to be investigating sexual assault against adult victims. And they hired me to incorporate this community resiliency model training into that course in a way that was going to be accepted more by cops, right? So I teach, it's once a month, I teach the class for the state. It's a week-long class, but I teach like an hour and a half on crim model, and I teach about an hour and a half on the Friday about kind of the realities of being a cop and an investigator and what that looks like and how to stay healthy in the long haul. And so I think that's like step one, is understand our nervous system, start to recognize it, but also start to have that vocabulary. So when our partners are also struggling, we can also talk to them about it and have, some understanding about what to do about it.
Yeah.
Because I found it to be, I use it with children in the world, and it's stuff that intuitively a lot of us already do. But I think teaching a simple model to people that they can actually use in real life makes it more meaningful. So again, I think that's step one. And I think that's internal, but I think step two is bringing back kind of the sense of community in our profession, like what I experienced in Hayward PD growing up, where my dad had a lot of friends that were cops and firefighters, and those were some of the most impactful people I've ever known. I remember our football coaches, two of them were full-time police officers, and then the assistant principal, who also helped as a weightlifting coach, was a reserve officer and a seasonal officer for the regional park police down in California, there where we grew up. And these are people who had a huge impact on my life, because they were volunteering their time as coaches at a really poor school. We would have 15 people try out for football at my high school, and it was a school of like 2,000 students.
Wow.
And so these coaches were volunteering their time, and they were cops, yes, so that was an influence on me, but they were great human beings and were connected to their community and to the kids in it. And so I think, personally, the other area of interest I have, in addition to kind of that wellness peer support, is about getting cops connected to kids in neutral environments that have nothing to do with being a cop.
Yeah.
And I run weightlifting programs at high schools and middle schools, and called Badges and Barbells. And it's a great way for me. I love it because I love coaching and I love interacting with kids and seeing them grow. And but it's also replenishing for me to do that. Whereas in the old gym, I used to do it to get paid, and I don't even know why. Sometimes I was doing it when I worked at the CrossFit gym, but when I do it at the schools, it's I get to work out with the kids and bang some weights, but also building these relationships and community. So again, I think, to me, in law enforcement nowadays, those are the two things we're missing, is connection to community. And community can be our PD, but it has to be more than that. We have to be connected to the community where we work. If we're not, then all the rest of the stuff's not going to really work, right? And the other piece of that is our nervous systems pay attention to it. And then when we notice our dysregulated, do something about it, right? And for me, it literally means that I have to do less and I have to focus on sleep. Mm-hmm. My workouts look totally different now than they used to look. Whereas I used to work out, do something every day, 7 days a week. And more is better, right? You come to realize as you get older, now I'm in my 50s and I'm still able to perform at a high level. I'm still strong. I'm still fast. I'm still able to have good capacity, but my workouts, I'm only working out a couple days a week, and I'm being very specific and focused when I do it, because I want it to be for lifelong health and wellness, not just to be big or strong or fast. But the result is you end up being bigger, stronger, and faster as a result, right?
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, that's huge. And a few themes like pop into my mind that I circle around, and they're aligned with some recent episodes. But one is like, just know thyself, right? That introspection is huge. And it's not just being intuitive. Like some people that's a huge hurdle to jump, because you don't have the acumen, right? You don't have, as you said, the vocabulary. Like you can't put words to it, right? We can think back to, when we were little, or maybe we have little ones, and I do, but we're trying to help like our daughter put words to what she's thinking, or at least recognize, even if she can't put words to it, recognize what's going on, and then talk through later, and talk through in the moment, like what she feels she needs, or what's helpful, what helped last time she felt this way or a similar way. And like, you're absolutely right when teaching young men, how to grapple with these things, and at least stereotypically or categorically, I think there's a lot of academia supporting the fact that young women articulate themselves better than young men do, and there's social dynamics and all that. But without going too much in the weeds, super relevant. Like as we're dealing with this increasingly complicated society. Well, I also hear this kind of like back to basics, and a lot of cops know like the WIN acronym, like what's important now, and you have to take those moments in this point in life, like what's important now, and right now it might be working out less, or right now might be saying no. And even with that, all of us doers, all of us that are so purpose driven, I think that your last point and recognizing it has to be about community and the whole, however you want to interpret that, like it's not just about us, right? And yeah, we are going to be our best when we are of service to others, but also we can't be of service to others if we don't take care of ourselves, right? And so, uh, determine your why, right? Refocus on purpose and take it back down to basics. You're talking about coaching kids, and like, what's more valuable than that, like the next generation? And certainly a lot of us can get distracted by different things, and we can justify things, and we can fight our own ego at times. Like what does help you say no to things? Because I know that you've talked about some of your different hats and roles, and you barely scraped your resume. And just to tell the listeners that you know DC McCurdy is not just the peer support wellness guy. Like a lot of that, he's a DT guy, and he's a use of force guy, and I think that it's sometimes easy to write off the people that lean into wellness because it feels like touchy feely. But I can even remember a lot of periods of my career where it comes back to safety and tactics, where I'll get super riled up. And like I've told officers when I was a sergeant, like, hey, if I see you do that again, I am going to write you up. Like you have no cover. You didn't draw your gun. You should have done all these things. Like, let's just have a conversation about it. It's going on paper next time. Do you understand? Right? Like that was as the peer support guy, but like ultimately it's about being safe and keeping cops well and alive and thriving. I say that all to say, like, when you have such high achieving, high drive people like yourself, what you could say, like, yeah, you need to say no, and you've done that, but what really helped you get there?
So, my wife and I, we've done a lot of work. My twins that were born premature are 14 years old now, by the way. And my son is blind and he's on the autism spectrum. And, it's still a struggle every day for him in a lot of ways. My daughter, his twin, has really bad anxiety. She struggles with some mental health issues, and we do a lot to kind of help her through it. I really had to step back and say that is more important to me than any of this other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've never been one who's really had a career plan. I've never really I've never done the typical things to build a resume. I didn't even have a bachelor's degree until I was in my mid 40s. And the only reason I did that was because I was a chief and I had to do budget and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so I went back to school and got my bachelor's in business
It's
management.
very responsible of you. That's more than most people will do in that position.
Well, I went back and it was great, right? And then I continued and got my master's in education because I love teaching and I wanted to be better at it, right? So for me, the things I've done have not been because I had a master plan. It's because I have something I'm trying to get done and I'm trying to figure out the most efficient way to do it. But it came to a point for me where, in order to focus on family, my dad had always said that you should be a cop in the community where you police. I mean, in the community where you live.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't done that in a long time. And I've lived here in the Sumner area. I actually live in Puyallup, on kind of right near Sumner. And I reached out to the chief, Brad Maricki's his name, and I've known Brad for a long time. And I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to come to Sumner, but I did know that there was a lot of baggage with me in King County. I'd been there for a long time. I'd done all the things. I was still felt like I was doing 3 or 4 of the old jobs I had given up many years before. And so it was just this accumulation of things that I was doing. And, after that physical crisis I went through, recovering from that, I realized I needed to make some changes. And again, the first changes I made was I did more. I went back to school and I got my bachelor's and master's when I probably didn't need either, right? But what I decided was I was going to reach out and find out. It would be hard to leave a contract city chief job in a large organization and go back to a different department as a patrol officer.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to find out, like, what is it like to be a small city police chief? So I reached out to my friend Brad. He agreed to meet me for coffee. We ended up talking for like 3 hours, and A couple of weeks after he reached out to me. He said, "Hey, my deputy chief's retiring and I'm going to post a job I think you should put in." And it was a little quicker than what I had expected or wanted, but I put in for it and went through the whole process and got selected. And being able to remove myself from, and again, being a sheriff's department with elected sheriff, and there was just a bunch of controversy all the time around that stuff. And that large organizations too, there's always just a lot of politics no matter what, especially as you start to rise up in an organization. Being able to step away from that and come to a small department, having a 5 or 10 minute commute instead of what was at times 2-hour commute each way, did a lot, I think, to save me as a person and save my career and everything else. And I'm not saying that people have to leave the agency they work for necessarily, but I do think we have to make choices about assignments, about commitments. And I think at some point we have to look at, if the life that we're leading isn't meeting our expectations, we need to have an honest conversations with ourselves about what we need to change. And for me, it was about withdrawing a little bit from, and it was painful to do so. I mean, I gave up a lot of really close friendships and commitments and programs that I had built that I felt responsible for. But doing so allowed me to focus on my family. And it was interesting. My wife and I were sitting on the couch together one weekend, and I hate electronics. I hate social media. I removed myself from that because it's a distraction for me, and it's an aggravation and everything. But so if I'm on my phone, it's only because my wife's on her phone, and she has an internet-based business now, so she's always on social media. And so if I'm on my phone, I'll be reading the news or something, right? And it was like a beautiful Saturday, and my wife and I are on the couch together, and our kids are like up in their rooms, probably playing on their electronics. And I think I had read every news story there was to read on the internet, and I was just kind of sitting there. I remember thinking I was bored. I looked over at my wife, and she's scrolling on Instagram or something, and I had this epiphany that it wasn't boredom, that it was loneliness. And here I was sitting next to the person I love more than anybody else in the world. And we have an opportunity to spend time together and connect, and yet we're distracted from that. And for me, part of my problem was that for a long time, coming home was traumatic from work, because the thing that caused me trauma, my son, is there, right? And I love him more than anything, but it was a trauma. And every time I see him, every time I'm with him, especially when I see his limitations or what he can't do, it kind of traumatizes me, right? And so for me, making things right, working through that, staying reconnected with my son, that epiphany for me about I was lonely, not bored. Trying to figure out how to reconnect was really important. One of the things I do with my son, because he's blind and on the autism spectrum, he doesn't experience the world the same as you and I, right? And for him, it's really hard to get him to put down electronics and go outside. He just doesn't want to be outside. It doesn't make sense to him necessarily, right? So it's like a battle to get him to go out and take his dog for a walk. And he has a service dog that's an amazing dog, and he loves that dog. But it's like, come on, buddy, we got to go for a walk. I don't want to go. So I would take my phone with me, and I would record noises, and we call them sound effects. And I'd record like a bird chirping in a tree, or wind chimes on my neighbor's front of their house blowing in the wind, or a car driving by, or an airplane flying overhead. And I'd record these, and then we'd come back home and we'd burn them to a CD, and he'd listen to these noises over and over again, like a photo, like watch it, like looking at a photo album or something. And he'd relive these experiences. He has a phobia of needles, and one time when I take him to get blood drawn, he has to have blood draws quite frequently. I have to physically restrain him, and he screams while they're drawing his blood, even at 14. And I remember one time I recorded that, and I burned it to a CD. He thinks that's the funniest thing ever. He listens to it over and over again, right? It brings him back to that moment. It takes away some of the trauma of that for him, because he's able to know, hey, I did survive that. I was okay, right? But for me, like just learning to be present again, learning to reconnect with my son and my wife, and working through all that. I mean, for me, therapy was a huge part of that too, to learn to reconnect. There's a type of therapy. A lot of people have heard of EMDR, a derivative of that called ART, which is accelerated resolution therapy. And it's basically a very compressed version of EMDR. And you can experience a lot of the same benefit that would take like a year to cover an EMDR, and you can do it in like one session with ART.
Oh, wow.
And it's where you can go in, and some people describe it as it's like a scalpel, where you go in there and you address one very narrow specific area of your trauma. And so for me, I experienced ART with a friend of mine who's a therapist who I really trust. And I went in there because I wanted to deal with this trauma of my son and my daughter's early birth, and that trauma that I felt when I would come home. And every time there was another call or emergency from my wife, I would think it was, they're going to be the end of the world or whatever. So this ART, it was interesting because, long story short, I thought that I was going to go in there and deal with the trauma of his early birth, but the trauma I actually had to deal with was how it broke certain aspects of my relationship with my wife, and how her and I were disconnected because of this trauma. Part of the disconnection was because we experienced trauma so differently. For me, I put my head down, I get stuff done. For her, she just has to be very present and kind of wallow in that trauma, right? And it kind of draws things out. It's very long and painful, right? But she's at least experiencing it. Me, I just move on and miss a lot of it, right? So for me, as I went through this therapy, it basically removed a wall from her and I and helped us reconnect in a different way. The other piece that came out was not the trauma of the past, but the trauma of the unknown for the future. And for my son, one of the hangups I have is that I don't know if he's ever going to be able to live independently. I don't know if he's going to have a job. I don't know what his abilities really are. One of the really beautiful things in ART, it's actually scripted. So the therapist actually reads these prompts and then you process them internally. And you don't even have to talk during an ART session. They'll read you the prompts, you think about it.
Oh, wow.
And as you're doing that, you actually watch their hand, and it does reprogramming similar to EMDR. And then they'll stop and they say more, continue or stop, and then you'll go on to the next prompt. But one of the prompts they talk about in there is they ask you to visualize a bridge that takes you from where you were to where you're going. And that can be any kind of bridge you want. And you're just kind of traversing this bridge. And so for me, what my brain went to was I was at the Golden Gate Bridge, because that's the area where I grew up. And as a family, a couple times we walked across that bridge, and it's beautiful and everything. And so I imagined myself and my family crossing this bridge. And the whole time I'm like, come on, guys, let's go. And they're like dragging their feet. They don't want to walk. And then all of a sudden something flipped on me. And instead of them dragging behind me, all of a sudden my son was in front of us, and he had on his backpack and he had a service dog in his cane. He's like, peace out. He just like walks off into the sunset. Right. And then my daughters and my wife and I were all there together, and we felt really good and confident that he was going to be okay. And so for me, there was something about that experience. And, EMDR and ART and these different therapies, they don't remove your memories. They don't alter the memories at all, but they soften the emotion related to that memory, right? And like I talked about earlier, the emotion is actually created by our nervous system. One of the things they do is, because they take the memory out of an improper area of storage in our brain that may trigger us and cause that nervous system reaction, and they move it to long-term storage where it's not related to the emotion, we start having less of those physical experiences of trauma when we start thinking about or reliving or being triggered to something from the past, right? So for me, it was really powerful. For one thing, I had to unplug from all that I was doing in my job. Then I also had to do these somewhat extreme measures to really learn to reconnect, really learn to find community and family again. The other piece of it, I recently went to something called Warrior Path. And it's here in Washington State. It's sponsored by a PTSD Foundation, which stands for Permission to Start Dreaming. And the program is for veterans and first responders. And it's a 7-day peer-led, essentially inpatient trauma training, they call it, but it's essentially treatment. And then it's followed up by another 90 days of check-ins and lessons and connecting with your group virtually to kind of work through how everybody's doing. And so I'm still in the process of that. I think I'm in month 2 after. And again, reconnecting, finding connection with people. The interesting thing with that particular experience, I think that ART helped me a ton. It helped me really reconnect with my wife and my family, helped me be able to disconnect from work and not feel guilty about it when I went through that. And when I went to the Warrior Path, I felt like I was no longer at some point, post-traumatic stress. At some point it was an injury. That injury turned into an abscess and became a disorder, right? And I think that with all the help I received, I felt like I was on the path toward post-traumatic stress growth. And I think I was a better person because of what I had been through, but I still had some hangups. I still had some issues going on that were getting in the way. And one of the things that came out, it was actually on the last day of Warrior Path. We did a labyrinth exercise, and in the labyrinth exercise, we did it midweek. And when I did that, you're supposed to leave behind something that you want to abandon, you don't want to have in your life anymore. And for most of the guys in the group, it was really powerful. They left something behind. And for me, I was like, I don't really have anything I want to leave behind anymore. I feel like I'm unloaded a lot, right? So when I did that labyrinth exercise on the last day, it was as I was actually walking into the middle of the labyrinth, and I had this rock that I'm supposed to leave behind, that I had this epiphany that I was still harboring guilt for my son's premature birth and his disabilities and everything. And even though logically I didn't cause any of it, right? I can easily point back and say that all of his medical issues, there was something that happened before them. that maybe we had done something differently or made a different choice, we may have avoided some things, right? But I wasn't never felt responsible for it. But I feel like in that I had to acknowledge my guilt for a terrible thing, right? And I had to have acknowledge that it was okay to have guilt, even though I wasn't responsible for it, right? And for me, like leaving that guilt behind, it was very empowering and very much something that allowed me to really fully shift myself into that growth period of my life and out of that injury or disorder. So for me, that's a big part of it. Is I think whatever we do, we really have to get to the bottom of what is still getting in the way of our growth and what is getting in the way of us connecting with our family and our friends and finding joy and meaning in work or our personal lives, wherever it may be. And it takes a lot of work. It takes, a lot of different techniques and different approaches to really get to the bottom of that. I think as we uncover one issue, it just exposes more, right? But that's it's all about the journey and not the destination. We need to, really be present while we're going through that journey and appreciate it for the beauty that we can find while we're there. So for me, that's been a big part. Like I said, the answer is to try different things. Sometimes we're trying too much, and that's a problem too.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the wellness world and in peer support, I think a lot of times we feel like we're like a pirate ship, right? And we kind of sit out in the harbor until we swoop in and raid, and then we leave again. And it's like our administration, our chiefs, and everybody kind of know it's happening, but they don't understand it. They just let it occur, and because they think it's good for their people. But I think we need to be better than that. I think we need to do a better job of assembling appropriate resources, making sure our people have access to them and feel comfortable, like they're not going to lose their job just because they're asking for help. We need to, as a leader, we need to show people that we also are vulnerable and we also have our own struggles. And I think doing so can empower them to also seek that help. And I think that's how we start to look at our organization and our people and create that change, right?
Yeah.
For me, being able to tell the story about all the things I've tried. And I think my version of trauma is very different than a lot of cops, because mine, I investigated, sexual assault and child death for a long time, and I still teach that. So I have a lot of that typical cop trauma. Like I said, I've lost partners and friends to suicide and line of duty death and everything else, cancer, you name it. But I think I've had an unusual accumulation of all those traumas in my life. I'm also a cancer survivor, and that as a teenager, and that changed me as well. And that kind of partly made me who I am with that, just get my head down and get stuff done, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think we have to be emotionally intelligent and, that social emotional language and that we need to be able to understand ourselves. And, for me, that my path of understanding myself and sharing with others helps me understand myself better as well. But then also helps destigmatize and offer care and support to others. So I think that's the answer, right? We all have to go through our own journey. And I think if we can be boldly vulnerable about our journey and share with others, I think that's what helps us connect and heal ourselves, but also be there for others when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, you covered so much ground, and I'd really encourage, I know I'll be listening back to this, and it revisits a lot of communication that we've had like offline, right? Whether it's about peer support and organizational health and leadership, your decision and your struggles to leave what you knew and where you're so effective and involved with all these teams and all these people are depending on you to go smaller in seeking this other thing, right? This other why, this other what, and not because it's any better or worse, but because it's different and it might just generate what you need, like what your soul needs and what you need and what your family needs. And so cool to hear that reframe and that example, interacting with, Chief Brad and what you're able to have there and what you're able to contribute. It goes back to, or where my mind goes is towards that early part of the discussion where you talked about, that family aspect that you haven't really seen since, and whether it exists anywhere. And sometimes I wonder about that, because the notion of a police department being a family has literally become a meme, in social media and the internet of, I'm of the opinion that we probably should abstain from using that word for the whole organization. But I like to inject quickly, like, hey, there are people here, there are groups here that are your family and you rely on, and you can rely on just like your family. But I get nervous because I've seen how people can react when something doesn't go well, or when, the boss, aka dad in this situation says something or does something that's unfavorable. But I say that all to say that I have strong confidence that if it doesn't exist, Sumner's probably got the best shot at getting it based on what you bring and what Chief Brad brings, and in your alignment, and trying just to literally support people the way they need.
Well, and I'll be very blunt about that too. Even since I've been here in Sumner, we've had some officers here that were struggling, that and some of the results weren't great. I think that what I've tried to do as a leader is be here for people, but there are people who still are not going to accept the help, right? And I think sometimes we have to be the bad guy and realize that if certain behaviors or decisions damage an individual's reputation, or the reputation of the agency, or violate policy to a point where people have to leave, we can still part ways with people and do so in a way that we try to be respectful. And that's where I think building systems that are fair and equitable and give people every opportunity to succeed and grow. But even in Sumner here, I walked away from some tough things in King County, but I've had some tough days here as well. So small agencies aren't immune to it by any means. But I will say that, here it felt like a family, but I feel like since I've been here, we've really built a cohesive unit. And, I think that as a department, I agree with you. Sometimes using that word family with our agency is not a good fit, but I think within this agency, we should at least feel like family, right? And sometimes we have that creepy uncle that nobody wants to hang out with, or, whatever that person may be, that, but we still have to get to know each other. We have to have blunt conversations with each other. It's still a professional environment, so there are, appropriate boundaries and barriers and stuff there. But at the same time, family means it's the people you go to in crisis. And I feel like a lot of departments, you're not going to go to anybody in your department in crisis anymore. And sometimes even the wellness person or the peer support person in agencies are not a good fit, not the right person. And, for me as an example, I recognize I'm probably not ever, I'm still on our peer support team. I mostly am going to be there for logistics and support, but I think my role is two things. One, I want to advocate for peer support statewide, because there's a lot of problems with how we administer peer support in the state still that we're trying to work through. But on the other side of it, I think that the group of officers that are struggling the most in our profession right now are chiefs and commanders. And I think that when we talk about not being part of the family and being lonely by its very nature, when you're in a leadership position, especially as the head of an organization, you have very few peers to interact with. And so I'm really trying to build a network where chiefs can speak openly and ask for help, and have people understand them that they can reach out to for care and support. And, I think if we as chiefs are healthy and well, that our officers are much more likely to be healthy and well also, right? That whole, I don't even know where it came from. I've tried to look it up, but, healthy people help people, hurt people hurt people. And I see a lot of the ways, even people who are trying to portray themselves as wellness people, who don't have a healthy perspective, and their agency doesn't appreciate or understand them because they can see that they're suffering as well. And that's the part that I'm trying to figure out how to kind of get my arms around.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I'm glad you brought that up. I talked on here with retired Sergeant Chris Luttrell about that, that command staff, like, it's lonely at the top. And I've felt a drastic change in how certain people interact with me, with each promotion. And, it's just part of the thing sometimes. And I know from shared perspective that can only continue as you continue to ascend. But why you do it, and what your role is, and it shifted, right? I recognize that since I went to commander, not necessarily as many people are going to text me and say, hey boss, you have time to talk. It still happens, which is humbling, and it's appreciative, or appreciated. Know that I have that role still for some people, but I know that as time goes, and certain people just won't know me that way, and that's okay. But we all have a part to play in this whole connectedness. But I know from going, to prior to starting and hitting the record, I know that one of your main goals was just to share story and share vulnerability and demonstrate that. And you've certainly done that in spades. And so I'm very rewarded to be just a small part of being able to help you share your story, because I think that is such a thing when you have a chief as yourself able to share perspective from your different experiences through life, through career, it enables and emboldens and empowers other police leaders to do just that. Um, because ultimately that is what is necessary to help our profession. And you said it so well, like that there's that modeling that you're doing from the top, but also modeling care, to go back to an earlier part of the conversation and something you shared, which is that you know, there's a I believe there's a direct correlation to, like, if we treat our people and like our family, like if we treat them looking for how we can support and nurture their needs and develop them, then they're absolutely going to translate that to the community, right? Because they're all the people, the boots on the ground doing the everyday work. And so it is that notion for those that are still not on board to this very seemingly obvious notion that we need to support police wellness and mental health awareness, kind of your quote unquote traditionalist or what have you. Like, there is a direct, I suppose, correlation with how we show up for our people and how they show up for others. And if you just want to make it just about doing the job, yeah, it's going to help you do that too. So I really want to say thank you for sharing in the ways you have. There's so many other questions and kind of notes I made, but we've covered so much ground, and without detracting from the main messages, I hope so many people, and I know so many people get so much from this, but this is one that I know needs to get shared, and a lot of people need to tune in and listen to this and play it back.
Well, sometimes I worry that I get invited to talk about things as a cautionary tale. But my story's still not done. And, I feel like kind of moving forward, I think we're finally having these conversations, and I think it's finally becoming cool to talk about, wellness. I think, and fitness, things like that have been talked about for a long time, but I think really getting the bottom of things and having these discussions about what's really going to heal our people, I think is really important.
Yeah, I don't think I'll interject. I don't think it's a cautionary tale at all. I mean, certainly there's things that you're like, well, I could have done without that experience, or you course corrected and you're like, maybe I could have done that earlier. But here you are, resilient as ever, continuing to fight the fight and do the work, and that's part of it. It's the vulnerability, not to say like you avoided mistakes, or no, you're still working through it, and that's what I really appreciate, and that's where I see you as a true leader, a true mentor, and I put so much value in that word and that notion, and you're truly one of my personal mentors. And even not to detract from the conversation, but just to feel out this struggle like this, at times I feel like it's an illusion, this work-life balance or purpose in organization. I've grappled with what my role should be. Should I promote? Should I work here? Should I work there? Like, these are things that are really hard to digest and dissect and process, and for you to provide that to me, but also to so many people through this interview alone. I mean, those are real things. And then there's home, there's our loved ones, and it's so much to unpack, and I know that we can all glean so much.
I think the hard thing is it's not one thing, it's everything, right?
Yeah.
And it's not something that we can fix in a day, a week, a year. It takes a lifetime to work through this stuff, right? And I think in our society nowadays, we want to, if I sleep better, that's going to fix everything. Or if I, do more cardio, that's going to fix everything. Or if if I see a therapist, that's going to fix everything. It's like, no, it's a constant. And as soon as you fix the one issue or you feel better about the one, there's going to be something else. So, I think that, again, openness, vulnerability, willing to seek help, building your network of friends and supporters. That's the part that I think we need to focus on as a profession.
Yeah, absolutely. For those that this is resonating with you, you are or have or will grapple, as I have and will grapple, with redlining and burnout. It's not, you can't just do less harder, right? Like, you got to go softer and release and give grace, mostly to yourself.
Yeah.
Deputy Chief McCurdy, I want to be conscientious of your time. I know that we're coming up on 1300 where you have some other things, but
yeah, I have a budget meeting. Maybe we should talk longer so I can get out of it.
Yeah. We do need to have you back and talk about like peer support programs, what people need to consider for the brass tacks. policy programs, what you nodded to in helping the state of Washington navigate that, which is fantastic. But is there anything that you'd like to leave the listeners with in summation, and where people can potentially get in contact with you?
Well, I just wanted to thank you. I know that a lot of the work you're doing is kind of bringing this up to prominence and getting people to pay attention. I struggle with how to get this information to the right people, and I think you're doing amazing work there. So if people want to reach me, they're going to have to find me, come to Sumner. I don't have any social media of any kind. I think I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't check that very often.
Yeah, you're all hiring. I feel like you're doing pretty well in the scheme of things.
I got one vacancy right now.
Yeah, that is a huge positive sign.
Yeah. We've hired here in Sumner. We only have 21 total, and we've hired 9 in the 3 years since I've been here. So we've had a lot of retirements and stuff. So we're doing pretty good. So for me, the recruitment part, I expect one more retirement next year, maybe this year, and then another one the following year. But I'm hoping to keep things pretty stable and just wait for the right people to apply. I don't seem to have to go out and look for people very hard.
That's a great sign. It means you're doing things right.
But yeah, no, if people, I actually love having these kind of conversations, and I love when people are dealing with, especially if it's a person in a leadership position, dealing with a person who's struggling and what to do to help them without enabling them. I love having those conversations as well. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, most people I think know how to get my phone number in here in Washington. Also my brother's a great resource for all this stuff as well. But no, I appreciate all the work you're doing, and not just for your agency, but for our profession, and just keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Yeah. All right.